Thank you so much for inviting me to, come and share with you some thoughts about this. I have been to Japan a few times in the last 2, 3 years, enough times that by now I know people and I no longer get lost on the subway. It is starting to feel like a second home nearly, and I am really happy to be here and to talk with all of you and to get to know so many additional people. And really, I'm honored for the invitation to be with you here today. So, it is kind of a very difficult assignment to talk about academic publication. There is, a huge amount that one can say, and it's very hard to say something that is broadly applicable to, the field of linguistics is so broad. Writing in phonetics is very different than writing in sociolinguistics or in anthropological linguistics. But I have been an academic for nearly 30 years, and I have a lot of experience as an author and an editor and a reviewer in the publication process. So I just dug into my set of experiences to come up with, the way that I like to think about academic writing when I do it myself, and the way I often talk to my students about it. So here is a quick outline of what I want us to spend some time together on today. So why do we do research, right? Why do we do this thing that is research? What is research? I'm specifically thinking there, what is publication-oriented research, right? So how do you find out research that is ready to be submitted to a journal? Then look at the broader academic endeavor that we all engaged in, the research endeavor, and ask where in that big picture does publication fit? And I think all these things are good to think about when you think about writing for a journal, to understand, it's not an isolated thing of our jobs. It's part of a bigger ecosystem and where it fits in. And then we'll spend the majority of our time looking at a few somewhat randomly selected out of the nearly infinite number of things one can talk about, kind of general guidelines for what to do and what not to do when you write an academic journal article. So why do we do research? Well, one reason that we do research is for society, right? So here on the screen, you have a quote from the very first article that appeared in the very first issue of the journal Language in 1924, well, 1925. That's when the Linguistic Society was founded, and the same time that the society was founded, the journal was started. And the very first article in Language was written by Leonard Bloomfield, one of the foundational thinkers of 20th century American linguistics. And he was also the first president of the LSA. And, the title of that very first paper was, Why a Linguistic Society? Why should we form this society that brings linguists together, right? And this is a quote towards the end of this paper. If you've never read it, go and read it. It's only 4 pages long, and it's really kind of fascinating to see how 100 years ago we were thinking about why we need gatherings like this. But towards the end of his paper, he says, so why do we need a society, a linguistic society? Not only for the furtherance of our science, so not just for the sake of doing research, but also the needs of society. Right? And I think that's important to realize, even if you do theoretical linguistics research or documentation of a minority language somewhere, ultimately we are doing this for society, right? We make a contribution to society. But not only just for society, we also do research for ourselves, right? We wouldn't be academics and researchers if we are not boundlessly curious, if we don't want to know what is currently unknown, and we wouldn't be doing this if we're not getting joy out of doing research and doing discovery. And I think it's really important to keep both of these two things in mind, because sometimes you need to remind yourself, I'm not alone, I'm working for society. And sometimes when you get reviews back from a journal that's negative, you have to remind yourself, I actually like doing this. And we have to focus on the joy that we get out of what we do when we do research. So what is research? Right? So kind of by definition, research is find a topic that nobody knows the answer to now and figure out the answer. So research has to be something new. But just finding something new isn't going to make research publication worthy. It's not going to be publishable research. Because there's many things that are new that nobody knew before, but that isn't interesting enough or important enough or insightful enough that it can be published. Because let's think about it. If you think about a journal, you know, if the typical journal, let's say, appears 4 times a year, in every issue there's 4 or 5 papers, so we're looking at 20 to 25 papers a year that can fit into most academic journals. And there's many, many, many more people who write papers than those number of journals. Many, many more people who do research. So you need to find a way to present your research not just as new, but as interesting, as important, as insightful. And very often, that has nothing to do with the content of your research, but about how you present it, right? So you need to convince the reader that this research is interesting, important, innovative. And that is really, therefore, part of the rhetoric, the communication style that you have to use beyond just the content. The content matters. That alone is not going to get you published. How you present it, as interesting, as exciting, as important. But we also have to be realistic, right? So research is you need to find something new, something important. But let's say I borrowed this representation from a mathematics professor on the web somewhere. So let's think about knowledge creation. Let's imagine that circle on the screen is the totality of human knowledge, right? That's all that humans know over the history of humankind. Now you go to primary school and you start learning some general information, but you don't know very much, right? You just kind of start to acquiring knowledge. And you go to high school and you learn a little bit more, and now you go to university and you pick a major and you start specializing, but you still aren't generating any new knowledge, right? You're still just kind of learning existing knowledge that's already there, but you start specializing when you choose linguistics as a major. And now you go on and you do a master's degree, so you get more and more specialized, you know more and more knowledge about your field, and then eventually you reach the edge of the circle. So now you're kind of ready to start writing a PhD dissertation, right? You have read the literature so that you know basically everything that is currently known about your topic, and you're at the edge of human knowledge. The next thing you're going to do is cross that edge and do something new. And that's when you start doing research, right? When you cross that boundary and add new knowledge to the body of knowledge. But let's zoom into just that part of the picture, right? So you're now at the edge of knowledge. That's research, right? So all you have to do is add a little bit. You don't have to like change the complete course of humankind's knowledge of the world. You just have to push the boundary of knowledge forward a little bit. So yes, when you want to do research, and especially you want to get publishable research, you have to contribute something new, something important, something exciting. But often that makes us think that we have to change the world or change the theory. That's not how research works. It's cumulative, adding one little bit at a time, building on what's already known, just adding a little bit, just communicating that little bit that you add as important, as exciting, as relevant, right? So that's research. You just add that one little bump to the big circle. You don't have to feel, I have to change the world. So yes, something new, but don't put the bar too high. Not as an author, and if ever you're asked to review a paper, also as a reviewer, remember, research is incremental, building a little bit on top of everything that's already known. Don't put the expectation too high on yourself or on other people. Okay, so let's think about the research ecosystem, right? Who are all the people involved in this thing that we call research? Well, there's the researcher, and that is going to be you yourself. And increasingly so in all subdisciplines of linguistics, it's not going to be only you, it might also be you and your collaborators. Sometimes it's just you, sometimes it's you and other people, but clearly the people doing the research, they are part of the research ecosystem. But it's an ecosystem, right? We don't do it on ourselves. There's a bigger research community. So people who work with you and help you, and that can be your advisor if you're a student. It can be your colleagues in your department, people you talk to over a cup of coffee about your research, can be people at a conference. So all of these people participate in your research because you exchange ideas with them, run your thoughts by them, get their feedback. So you don't do it. Sometimes it feels like we do it by ourselves. We sit in our rooms late at night in front of our computers and you feel isolated. But you're not. You're part of this bigger community that all work together. Okay, then we also have the sponsors or the funders, the people who provide the funding for the research. We have to think about them because, they are going to decide what research you can do. And in the United States, that might be the federal government, so the National Science Foundation or the National Endowment for the Humanities are people who would fund linguistics research, but often it's also just our universities, right? Not all research gets external funding. And if you work at a university and your university pays your salary, then they're kind of also sponsoring your research, right? They enable you to do your research. And increasingly in linguistics, also industry is becoming sponsors, right? Especially as we move into the more computational world. So we have to remember they're sponsors, and yes, they shouldn't dictate what research we do. We should have independence to pick our topics. But we also have to know that, yeah, there's people who pay for it, and we have a responsibility towards them. And on the other hand, we have our audience, the people that we want to talk to, we want to communicate with. And again, it might be the government, right? You might want to create a document that's going to influence government policy about language rights, minority rights, language education. It might also be the general public, so you might want to write a paper that is, an opinion piece published in the newspaper about, let's say, mother tongue education. It is most often, though, other linguists, or other members of your broader research community. That's usually our intended audience. And in between you as the researcher and your audience sits scientific communication, because that's how you communicate with your audience. And that can take many different forms. Giving a talk at a conference, that's scientific communication. Or writing a paper for a journal, that's scientific communication, right? And that's the part of the ecosystem that we want to focus on today, what happens between you and your audience. So let's zoom in on that part, right? So it's you as the researcher, and you want to write a paper to eventually talk to other linguists. So we're now thinking about journal publication. And we can think about this as a conversation, right? I write a paper. That is like me starting a conversation with my broader research community. They read the paper, they might incorporate it into their own research, they might critique it, they might agree with it or disagree with it, they might find you at a conference and talk to you about it. So you talk to your audience through publication. It's a strange kind of conversation because it's a very slow conversation. Right? You write a 30-page paper, it's like giving an hour-long monologue, and then you might have to wait 6 months or a year to get a response, but it's a conversation, right? We are participating in talking to our community. So they also talk back to us, right, through directly talking to us or using our research and their own research. And then in academic publication, we have this intermediary, the editorial team of the journal. And you're also in a conversation with them, right? You submit your paper to the journal. That is like you making an opening statement. And that's not the end of the conversation because conversations are two-sided. So the journal will also communicate back with you, and that's, you get reviews back, an editorial cover letter that summarizes the reviews. And that's not necessarily the end of your conversation with the editorial team because if you're lucky, you get a chance to revise your paper, write a response to the editorial team. So that's like you said something, they answered, you get to respond, they get to respond. And I think it helps to think about this as a conversation because conversations are two-sided. That means you get reviews and you don't have to agree with everything, right? So part of what you do is you try to make convincing argument. You try to use clear and strong communicative language. So you may say, thank you for the reviews. I agree with these 9 things and I incorporate them and it makes my research better. But these 2 things that you said, I don't necessarily agree, and this is why I don't agree. So if we think about it as a conversation, then reviews can be less harsh because it's the editorial team responding and you get to respond again. And you might go through this cycle a few times, right, with revise and resubmit, and then eventually the editorial team will accept your paper, and finally you can talk to your audience, right? So it's a long and a protracted process, and your goal is, when you submit to a journal, to get through the editorial team, right? So it's that conversation between you and the editorial team is the most important part of getting published. So how do you write your paper? How do you structure that communication to be most effective in convincing them, let me through so that I can talk to my audience, right? How do you get through the intermediaries? Okay, so that's the broad landscape, right? We want to talk to our audience. We need to get through the editorial team. And to do that, you need to use persuasive communication because you need to persuade the editorial team. You have space for 20 articles in your journal this year. You get 200 submissions. I should be one of the 20, right? So how do you structure your communication, your conversation with them to maximize the chances that they will be convinced that your research is worthy of publication? So your ultimate goal is to get through to your audience, so to get through the editorial team. And it is really all about creating expectations and then meeting those expectations. So how do you create expectations, right? The editorial team or the reviewers are getting many, many more papers than what they can accept to publish. And they may not know or think your research is interesting. It might not be their area of expertise or their area of interest. And you have to convince them this is going to be interesting and important. So when you write, you have to create the expectation with the reader on the first page. This is going to be interesting research. You're going to really enjoy reading this paper. And even if it's not your area of expertise, it's going to be relevant to you. You're going to find something interesting in here. Because if the first page is boring, they lose interest and they move on, right? So create the expectation. Talk about your research in a positive, excited way. You find it interesting, otherwise you wouldn't have done this. So communicate that excitement and that interest to the reader. So create the expectation, but then also deliver on it, right? If you start out by telling them, this is going to be a fascinating paper, you're going to love reading it, then make sure that as they get into the paper, that's actually true, right? They don't get frustrated. So we need to think when we do academic writing, both about the what do we write? What is the content of our research? And that needs to be good, solid research. But what alone is not going to get you published. You also have to think about how. What do you write? Is your research good? Is it solid? But solid research is not going to get you published. It's solid research that you communicate effectively is going to get you published. So the how part is just as important and maybe more important, because if you're editor of a journal and you get 200 submissions, there's maybe 100 of them that is solid research. You can only publish 25. You're going to pick the 25 that is solid research and that's communicated effectively. So effective communication is critical if you want to get through the editorial team to get published. Okay, so how do you know that your paper, your research, is ready for publication? Well, it has to be new and interesting and important, right? New because that's research. Research alone doesn't work. It has to be interesting and important research. So you have to convince, and not every topic that you do research on in your life is going to be interesting and important. You might find out once you got into this topic, you know what? in the end, it wasn't as groundbreaking as I thought. So find your good research that you feel this really matters, and that's the one you're going to put the energy in to get published. And then also, have you really figured it out, right? Research that you submit to a journal for publication is once you have explored every avenue and you're fairly certain of your analysis. So you don't submit something to a journal in the process to figure out what's happening, right? So it's kind of at the end of several years of struggling with the topic. You're done, you understand it, now you submit it to a journal. And then a few things that I think is good to remember. A good term paper is not necessarily a good journal article. Let's imagine you're in a master's or a PhD program and you're in a research seminar, which is a semester long, and at the end of that, your professor asks you to write a term paper, and you get an A on your term paper, and you think, great, I wrote a wonderful paper, I'm going to submit this to a journal. That probably won't work, because let's think about it. When a professor teaches a research seminar that's a semester long, and then at the end of that you write a research paper, how do we think about that, right? We evaluate that saying, this is work that somebody wrote who 3 months ago knew nothing about this topic, and they probably wrote this paper in the last 2 weeks of the semester, right? So we evaluate a term paper in that context. Is this good, given that it was written by somebody who's new to the topic and who did this in 2 or 3 weeks? And you get an A, it means it's good given that context. But for a journal article, when I review a journal article, I don't ask, is this what somebody would write who has been working on this topic for 3 months? I ask, if this is how somebody would write who is an expert on this topic, is this what somebody would write who have had basically unlimited time, years to explore this topic, right? So a good journal, a good term paper is often a good start for a journal article, but you might have to do a lot of additional work before it can go to a journal. And the same is true for a good thesis, a good dissertation, right? It's a different goal, it's evaluated differently, it's a different audience. You might take a chapter from a dissertation, but it might have to be reworked quite a bit to become a journal article. And how would you know if what you have is ready to be submitted to a journal? Well, one of the most important things you can do is read, read, read. Specifically, if you plan to submit to journal X or Y, read a lot of papers in that journal and see what kind of research is published there, how is it written. Read your field as widely as you can to determine what is known, what is not known, what is the style of successful papers, what are papers that you read and you understand the argument easily, how were they written. So you have to read very, very widely to start developing a feeling for what is good research. But also remember the research ecosystem we looked at. You're not alone. You're a member of a larger community. So your community can help you, right? Ask your advisor, give your paper to a colleague and say, can I get feedback on this? Do you think it's ready? What do you think I need to adjust? What do you think I need to add? Go and present your research at a conference and get feedback from the audience, right? So you're part of a bigger community and you don't have to decide and figure this all out on your own. Okay, so let's assume you have now decided that, yes, I have research, it's new, it's important, it's interesting, and I'm ready to submit it to a journal. What are you going to do now to make sure or to increase the likelihood of that going to be successful? Right? And this is where you now have to start practicing persuasive communication. It's a conversation, and you want to make your argument as well as possible in your opening statement when you submit the paper to the journal. You want to maximize the likelihood that you're going to convince the editorial team that my paper is worthy of publication. So, and to do that, you kind of need to convince the readers that your research is interesting and important and exciting. You obviously think it is, otherwise you wouldn't have spent the last 3 years of your life working on this topic. But the editorial team or the reviewers may not think it's exciting, right? It might not be their topic. They might never have thought about it. So it is your job to not only report the facts, but to report it in a way that makes them feel excited about the research, right? So communicate it in a way that brings across your level of interest to keep the reader engaged and to make them believe that your work is worthy of publication. So there are so many things that one could say about what does effective persuasive communication in academic publication looks like. And when I had to come up with what am I going to say in a 50-minute presentation, what am I going to select of all the many things one could say, I decided I will use the so-called Gracian maxims. I don't know if you've ever encountered Grace. If you do pragmatics or conversation analysis, you would have encountered the Gracian maxims. So I forgot exactly when Grace lived, but long ago. And he talked about how is effective communication structured? What is the properties of effective communication? And he identified these 4 maxims or guidelines known as the Gracian maxims. And it's not that the Gracian maxims is in any way special, right? It's all just about effective communication, persuasive communication. But we're linguists, so we can rely on Grace because that was a linguist doing pragmatics. And it does summarize kind of nicely some of the core properties of effective persuasive communication. So the 4 maxims of Grace is quantity, quality, relation, and manner. So we'll talk about each of those in turn. How does it apply to academic publication? Look at a few examples to see how one might apply that particular maxim. And as I say, it's hard to give a presentation like this because our own individual research is so different, and the style of writing in phonetics is so different from in theoretical syntax, so it's hard to give very concrete guidelines. These things we're going to talk about is more abstract, more broad about how to do effective communication and less about how do you write a phonetics paper, right? It's less specific than that. So let's look at each one of these maxims in turn, and we start with quantity. And the maxim of quantity is you should present to your interlocutor, to your audience, as much information as is needed for them to understand your argument, but no more. So don't give too little information, but also don't give too much information, right? Just the right amount of information. So when you write a paper, you have to ask yourself, what information is necessary for a reader to understand your paper? So what background information do readers have to know to understand your paper? And often you can just go and sit and make a list. Okay, this is about mora, so I need to talk about Moraic structure. It's about stress, so I need to review the literature on stress. I'm going to use the concept of feet, so I need to talk about feet. I'm going to talk about intensity and vowel duration. So what's all the things that people need to know to understand your paper? And then you have to ask yourself, of this long list of things that people need to know to understand my paper, which of this can I assume my audience to already know, right? What is part of the general knowledge that I can assume an informed linguist would have? And that you're not going to put in the background, because if you put it in your paper, you're going to insult and annoy your audience. They will feel like you're talking to us like they're first-year linguists. Don't tell us what a syllable is. We know what syllables are. So you kind of need to figure out, what can I assume the audience know? Don't tell them that. Which of all these bits of background I cannot assume that the general linguistics audience will know? So which of this is really specialized knowledge that I have because I have spent 3 years on this topic, but the average linguist out there doesn't have? And that's what goes into the background, right? So that's the enough information, but not too much, right? Don't talk to your audience as if they are dumb. And this is not necessarily that easy, right? Because how do you know what knowledge you can assume in the general linguistic public out there. If you've been a linguistic researcher for 30 years, you have had 30 years of kind of developing a feeling for that. If you're new and it's your first major research topic, research project, it's hard to know what of everything I know because I'm specializing in this topic, and what of it is broader general knowledge. So you're going to get it wrong earlier in your career, right? And reviewers will write back and say, you're assuming all this information that you can't assume, and therefore I couldn't follow your argument. Or they're going to write back and say, why do you spend 3 pages talking about this? This was settled in 1960. Don't waste time on this. So how do you figure out what you can generally assume? Read, right? So go and look at other papers and see what information do they share and what don't they share. And it will kind of give you a feeling for that, but also accept that you're going to get it wrong. And if the reviewers write back and complain about that, it's a conversation, and you say, thank you very much. I will now add discussion of these things that you have asked I should add, and I will take out discussion of these things you've said wasn't necessary. So let's look at an example. This is the first paragraph of a paper that was just published in the Journal of Phonology by Maria Guskova at New York University. So it's the very first paragraph. And you don't have to understand what it's about, but it shows us how she kind of differentiates between this information I can't assume, so I will explain it to my readers. This information I can assume because it's general knowledge in linguistics, and I'm not going to explain it. Right? So she starts out saying most constraint-based frameworks embrace richness of the base, and then defines what she means with richness of the base. The assumption that no interesting generalizations are stated as constraints on the lexicon, that is morpheme structure constraints. So you don't have to know what morpheme structure constraints are or what what this means. But what we see here is she introduces this term richness of the base. And if you happen to be an optimality theory person or a person who studied phonology in the 1990s, you'll know what this is. It's a very common term in optimality theory. But if you're a phonologist who started learning phonology in 2018, you might not have come across this term because it's no longer so prominent in the field, right? So she's kind of defining richness of the base because she realizes this is not something that I can assume any phonologist practicing phonology today is going to know the meaning of. And then if we go deeper into it, it says the main argument against morpheme structure constraints is that they introduce duplication into the theory when the same constraints define the shapes of morphemes and restrict derived words and so on. So here's a whole bunch of other technical terms, constraints, morphemes, and she doesn't define them because that's not necessary, right? If you were to tell a phonologist constraints, by that I mean blah, 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 or morphemes, by that I mean X and Y, they'll be annoyed, right? So you have to differentiate between what can I assume, don't share that, what can I not assume, explain that, right? And that's a skill that you will develop and not always get right. Okay, so that is quantity. Make sure you share all the information that is needed, but only that parts that you can't assume the reader to have. So as much as necessary, but no more. Let's look at the second of the so-called Gricean maxims, quality. So this is the one that says your communication should be true and it should be supported by evidence, right? So that's how Grice defined the second maxim. So obviously, when you do research, it should be true. Don't falsify your data, right? Your research should be true and accurate. That kind of is obvious. But that is not the only part of the quality maxim, right? The quality maxim says true and supported by evidence. And the and supported by evidence part, I think, is the more important part of the persuasive communication in academic writing. So how do you support your claims by evidence? Well, one way in which you can do that is to cite your sources, right? If you refer to a result, a claim about research knowledge that's in the general pool of knowledge out there, and you want to provide evidence for that, one thing you can do is cite your sources, right? You don't have to review necessarily all the detail of the previous research. You can tell your readers, I'm making this claim and I'm basing this claim on this body of research. That's the evidence for my claim. But very often when we do linguistic research, our claims are not based on existing research. Our claims are based on, we're looking at our data and we see a pattern in our data, and we're going to make a claim about that. This is our research, this is our contribution, this is a new bit of knowledge that I can't refer to existing literature to back that up. So we use a lot of data to back up our claims. Right? And that's a very important part of successful academic writing, successful persuasive communication. So if you make a claim, present evidence for it. But it's important when we think about this is it's not just present data, it's present the data and interpret that data as evidence for the claim. So explain to the reader, here is the claim I make, here is the data. That's not evidence. Data is not evidence. And then say, and here is how the data support my claim. Now you have turned that data into evidence. So let's look at an example of this. So this comes from a paper that I wrote when I was in graduate school in 2001 on Tswana, a Bantu language spoken in South Africa. And this is not exactly a direct quote from the paper, but it's based on it to kind of illustrate an example of making a claim without evidence, making a claim with data, but not interpreted data as evidence, and then a better way, right? So let's read this quote. The singular prefix of class 5 nouns in Tswana is an underlying nasal consonant. When attached to roots longer than one syllable, this nasal is deleted and hence doesn't surface. However, when the prefix is attached to a monosyllabic noun root, the nasal is realized as a syllabic peak. So there's a lot of claims in there, right? How are class 5 nouns realized? There's a nasal prefix, sometimes it deletes, sometimes it doesn't delete. So there's many claims made in there. At the moment, there's no support for that claim, right? So this is, I've made a claim, but I didn't provide evidence for it. So this won't work. If a reader reads this and they don't know Tswana very well, they won't even understand this. So you have to imagine, you know, I'm not writing to other Tswana researchers, I'm writing to general linguists, and I need to kind of give them data to understand this. So I can do this. So now I've given some words from Tswana. I challenge you to look at the quote and look at the data and try to figure out how do these data support the quote. Right, they're the relevant examples, but if this is all you give the reader, you make the work very difficult on them, right? They need to read the sentence, go to the data, try and understand how does the data support the claim. This is better because you've presented data, but you haven't explained how the data is relevant. You haven't presented it as evidence. So here is a third way of doing the same thing. So what's different here, right? I have now taken the examples and broken it up into two subparts because it's kind of two claims. The one claim is when we attach nasal consonants to long roots, the nasal doesn't delete. And the other claim is when we attach it to short roots, the nasal does delete. So now the data is presented like that. 4A, and I tell the reader, nasal deletion with roots longer than one syllable. And then give the data, mark the morpheme boundary so you can see the nasal is a prefix. Use forward slashes to show underlying forms, square brackets to show surface forms. So you can kind of look at those first three examples and easily see how they illustrate the fact that the nasal deletes. And then in the text above, it says, as shown in 4A. So when the reader gets to that point, they know, go and look at the examples in 4A. And then even in 4A, you kind of repeat the argument by giving a heading to the data to make it really easy on the reader. And then we get to 4B, and it says nasal peaks with monosyllabic roots, meaning with monosyllabic roots, the nasal doesn't delete. It's realized as a syllable peak. And then you get the examples again, right? So this is a claim without any evidence. This is a claim with evidence, with data, but you haven't interpreted it as evidence. You haven't explained to the reader how it supports your claim. This is data that you have presented in such a way that it's clear how it's evidence for your claim. And that's going to make it a lot easier on the reader to follow you, and it's going to make it much more effective communication, much better likelihood that the reviewers won't say, don't publish this, because you make it easy on them. They don't have to do the work of figuring out how this works. So always think about the reader and ask yourself, how can I make it easier on the reader? I did all the hard work of figuring it out. It shouldn't be as hard for the reader. It should be a lot easier for the reader than it was for me. How can I make it easier on the reader? So this is the quality argument, right? Obviously, what you say should be true. Saying things that are true is not enough. You also have to back up your claims with evidence. You can do it by citing your sources, but often in linguistics, that's not enough, because often we are making new claims, and then you have to present data. Don't just present the data, interpret the data. Explain to the reader, how do my data support the claim, right? So do the work for the reader. The reader isn't a first-year student who has to kind of look at the data set and figure it out. That's how you make an assignment in a first-year undergraduate class. That's not how you do academic writing. You don't ask them to figure it out. You tell them what it is. Okay, so that's quality. The third maxim is so-called relation. Right, and this says the information that you present should be relevant and pertinent to the discussion, right? So what do we mean by this? When you write a paper, let's say about Tswana, there are many, many, many things you can say about Tswana that is true. But only say the things that is relevant to the topic of Tswana you are writing the paper about, right? Don't put things that are true but not relevant to your argument in the paper. This is something that as a reviewer and an editor, I see a lot of, right? People spend a lot of time writing very detailed introductions with a lot of information that is all true, and then you get to the content of the paper and you're like, why did I spend 5 pages reading all this stuff when it wasn't relevant to the content of this paper? Because anything you put in a paper, the reader is going to expect, if you put this in the introduction, it's going to be relevant. So they're going to be looking for, as they read through the paper, why did I have to learn about syllable structure in this language? Where does that become relevant in the paper? And then if it doesn't become relevant, they're either frustrated or they feel I must have misunderstood something, because this person wouldn't have talked about syllable structure if that wasn't relevant. So clearly, I misunderstood the argument somewhere because I don't understand where syllable structure came in. And this is a very difficult thing to do, right? Because when you work on a topic, you amass a huge amount of knowledge and information about that topic. And all of that is important in your head. And you want to share all that information with the reader, partially because you think it's all interesting and partially because you want to convince them, I am an expert, I know a lot. But if you overshare, you frustrate the reader, right? So you need to find which information is relevant to the discussion and share only that. So let's look at an example. It's all about Tswana. It's still me. It's a different paper on Tswana. And let's just look at the title of this paper, Phonetically Grounded Phonology and Sound Change, the Case of Tswana Labial Plosives. And let's ask ourselves, if that's the paper and you are writing the introductory section, the background part of this paper, should you include in the paper information about the language family of the language Tswana and where it is spoken? Is it relevant to the topic of the paper? Well, it probably isn't relevant, right? It doesn't matter where a language is spoken, how its phonetic system works, but this is one that I think you can probably include, right? You write to linguists, as linguists, we love languages and we want to know more about them, and the average linguist wouldn't know Tswana as a Bantu language of South Africa. So that's probably okay to include that. Would you include in the introduction a discussion about the plosive inventory of the language? Which are all the plosives of Tswana? Would that be in the introduction of this paper? Probably yes, right? Because this paper is about Tswana labial plosives, right? So the reader might want to know, does Tswana have only labial plosives? Are there also alveolars? So that's probably relevant, right? You probably want to include that. Do you want to say something about the word order in basic declarative sentences of Tswana? No, right? It's not relevant to the topic. And this is not a completely ludicrous example. If you review papers, you find it so many times that the introduction gives you, yes, the phonetic inventory of the language. This is the word order of how adjectives are ordered relative to nouns. And then you get to the content of the paper, and it's a socio-phonetic paper. And you're like, great, I know about the word order in adjective phrases. That wasn't relevant. So that's an important skill to learn. Don't share all the information you know about the language. Share the bits that are relevant when you do the writing. Okay, so the last one of the so-called Gracian maxims is manner, and I think it's probably the most important one, because this says how are you going to do effective persuasive communication. Your communication should be clear, it should be brief, so don't say more than necessary. It should be orderly, so have a clear flow of the argumentation. It should be free from ambiguity. So basically in this fourth maxim, it's kind of write well. That's kind of the argument, right? Write well. But let's think about a few specific examples of what this might mean. So one important thing about successful academic writing is don't surprise your reader, right? A good journal article is very, very different than writing a murder mystery novel. When you write a mystery novel, you intentionally want to hide from the reader the result until the last page. And you want to surprise the reader. They shouldn't know what's the outcome. Academic writing, good academic writing, is not like that. A good academic writing is you tell the reader on page 1, this person was the murderer and he killed the person in this manner, and this is how I know. And then you get into the rest of the story. You give away the answer and the surprise at the beginning of the paper. So academic writing, good, clear academic writing, at the beginning, you give away all the information. You say, this is the problem I'm addressing in this paper. This is the kind of evidence that I'm using to explore this problem. Here are my main results. Now, let me get into detail of each of these, right? So you give away all the information at the beginning, no surprises. And if your paper is long and you have long and complicated sections, you might do that not only at the beginning of the paper, but also at the beginning of sections. So, okay, here is what I do in the whole paper. Now I'm in section 3, it's a long and complicated section. You might have another introductory paragraph in there saying, okay, in this section, we're going to focus on this topic. This is how the argument is going to flow, so that the reader knows when they start that section exactly what to expect, right? They're never lost. So a lot of guideposts, a lot of letting the reader know what's going to happen, what you should expect. So another paper, this time about Afrikaans, and this is the abstract of this paper. And it's an abstract we worked on very long, me and my co-authors, and with a lot of feedback from the editor. So they really pushed us to change the abstract. And I think in the end, it came out much better, right? At kind of successfully telling the reader exactly what to expect. So let's look at this abstract, right? The paper title is Cross-Language Interactions of Phonetic and Phonological Processes, Intervocalic, Plosive, Lanesian, and Afrikaans Spanish Bilinguals. But let's look at the paper, right? So we have the abstract, we have this very first introductory sentence, which is kind of a theme sentence telling the reader, this is the broad topic that this paper is going to be about. This paper explores how long-term bilingualism affects the production of intervocalic plosive consonants in the speech of Afrikaans Spanish bilinguals from Patagonia, Argentina. So the reader doesn't know what we found, but the reader knows this paper is about intervocalic plosives in bilingual speakers of Afrikaans and Spanish. You know what it's about. Then there's the methods part, right? So we perform sociolinguistic interviews, that's the nature of our data, with 3 speaker groups, L1 Afrikaans speakers, L2 Spanish speakers, the bilingual speakers, L1 Spanish comparison speakers, so people who don't speak Spanish, and L1 Afrikaans comparison speakers, speakers who don't speak Spanish. And then, so this is the data, sociolinguistic interviews with 3 speaker groups. We analyze these data using 3 acoustic measures. You know, now we're getting a bit more technical. What are the acoustic measures we analyzed to determine how much these plosives are lenited? So the reader knows the topic, intervocalic plosives. It knows what type of data we had. The reader knows what acoustic analysis we do, so knows exactly what to expect in the paper. And then there's a kind of summary of the results, right? So complex interplay, you know, sometimes L1 influences L2, sometimes L2, L1, so you kind of also describe the results. So if the reader were to read that, nothing in the paper is going to be a surprise to them. They know the topic, they know the data, they know how the data were analyzed, and they know the results. And in a sense, it's boring. Why would you read a paper if you already know the answer? But that's good academic writing, right? You don't want to surprise the reader. So no surprises, right? Tell the reader at the beginning and if necessary at multiple places during the paper. And sometimes it's not just telling the reader what's coming. Sometimes it's telling the reader, like, okay, we have now gone through the first 2 sections, and this is what we showed you in the first 2 sections. Now we will move on to the 3rd section and do the following, right? So regularly check in with the reader, give them all these guideposts, make sure the reader knows where you are in the argument, make it easy on the reader, don't make them struggle to know where am I in the flow of the argument. So something that that you can do, and this is generally a good exercise, and it's something that even after 30 years of academic writing, I still do myself often when I've finished writing a paper, is you write down just the section headings of your paper, just that, and ask yourself, can I reconstruct the argument of the paper by looking just at those section headings? And if you can, then probably your paper is structured reasonably well, right? The argument flows. But if you look at the section headings and you can't quite reconstruct the argument of the paper, then maybe you need a different section. Or maybe the sections have to be reorganized to make sure the argument flows. Or maybe you just have to change what you call each section, right? So, because maybe the headings of the sections don't clearly reflect the content of that section. And this is, again, to make it easier on the reader, right? Because a reader, often you look at the paper and the first thing you do is you scan through the paper quickly. You read the section headings, you know, and you kind of try and build in your head an expectation of what the paper is going to be. So make it easier on the reader, right? Make sure that's the case. And then you can also kind of do the same for every section. So now you know your sections flow logically, right? The overall structure of the paper is nice and logical. What about every individual section? And that becomes important, especially when you have long, complicated sections. So an exercise that I also still often do, especially when I write long, complicated things, is once you've written a section, then summarize each paragraph in the section with a short 5 to 10 word sentence, no longer than 10 words. And read just those individual sentences and ask, can I reconstruct the argument of this section by just looking at this one sentence that summarizes every paragraph? And very often that shows you there's a jump in the logic, there's some information missing, maybe paragraph 3 should come at the beginning, maybe that's a better way for the flow of the argument. So the important thing here is writing should be reflective, right? You need to do the writing and then go back and ask, is this the most effective way in which I can bring my point across, right? And writing therefore involves a lot of revision, right? Even before it goes into a journal. You write it yourself, and then you come back to it a week or 2 weeks later, and you say, let me try to read this as if I was somebody unfamiliar with this topic. Does the argument flow? It's sometimes really difficult to do because you might have worked with that topic for 2 or 3 years, and everything is crystal clear in your head. But try to imagine a reader who's seeing it for the first time, right? So think about not just what you communicate, but also how you communicate it. Okay, so one last example I want to look at, which is also part of making it easier on the reader, making communication and the structure of the argument more clearly, is if you can present your argument visually, right? You have to present your argument in text. You're writing a paper. The prose is really important. But you make it easier on the reader if in those places where in addition to the text, you can also make the argument visual in a diagram, in a table, in some way. You make it easier on the reader and they understand the argument better and they feel better about your paper. So here is a quote from a new paper that appeared in the Linguistic Inquiry by Caleb Belth. It's on formal modeling of phonological learning, so we're not going to get into the technical details of it. This comes from his literature review section, and what he is doing in this paper is he's looking at computational modeling of how learning of non-adjacent dependencies like vowel harmony, where you skip the consonant in the middle, how can we model learning things that have to skip like consonants in the middle, so non-adjacent dependencies. And then he wants to relate that in this part of his background research to what we know about how people learn dependencies. So he reviews the literature on how children acquire learning knowledge about dependencies. And then here he talks about infants, right? Infant studies are done, showed that they can learn adjacent dependencies, so they can learn something about this consonant appears next to this vowel, but they cannot learn non-adjacent dependencies, so kind of ignoring consonants in the middle. And then he gets into the literature that says, well, but once we get to around 18 months, now we start seeing evidence that children can learn non-adjacent long-distance dependencies. And then you get to, and in adults, obviously, we can do non-adjacent dependencies. So all the information is there in the prose. But if you were the reader, okay, and you read this, you read it carefully, you understand it, and now you're 15 pages later and you're looking at his experiment and you want to remind yourself, what did he find about human learning? You will have to come back and reread this whole thing, and it's going to take time and it's going to be difficult. So what does Belth do? Is he also summarizes it visually, right? So the exact same information. Now he's saying at 8 months, we have a check mark with adjacent. Infants can learn adjacent dependencies. A cross for non-adjacent. They can't yet learn that with all the research he cited. At 12 months, still the same. A check mark for adjacent, nothing for non-adjacent. We get into 15 months, and now there's a check mark for both. You can't quite see it here, but the check mark for non-adjacent is gray, meaning the evidence isn't very strong. And then we get to 18 months and adults, now everything is check marks, right? So it's no different than this, right? This wasn't necessary. All the information is here, but it's just making it so much easier on the reader by taking this complicated textual description and also make it visual, right? So it's a way to make your communication effective, efficient, easy on the reader, a lot more likely for the reader, the reviewer, to respond positively to your work. So this is something every time you write a paper. Once you've written a section, go back and read that section and ask yourself, is there any part of the argument that I can visualize in a diagram or a table or some way, right? How can I make the argument easier to see? Okay, so to end the last slide, why do we do research? Well, to serve the society, but also because it's fun. And it's important to remember the fun part, because research can be really hard. You can work for many months on a project only to find out it doesn't work. You run an experiment and it failed. You can submit your research to a journal and get very negative reviews. So there's a lot of negative, difficult things that happen in research. Remember why you do it. You do it because you get joy out of discovery, right, of new information, right? So remind yourself why you got into this business. Focus on the positive too. What is research? It has to be new, right? Research by definition is you adding new knowledge. New alone is not enough. If you want to get published, you need to communicate to your audience, to the reviewers. It's not only new, you need to communicate your excitement. You need to communicate that this is important, this is interesting, this matters. You need to convince them of that. And that means you have to talk with confidence, right? Don't use too many hedges. Act as if this is good and important research. Communicate your level of excitement about it. Pull them along. Make them see it's exciting. And remember, publication is only one part of a big ecosystem in which we exist, right? And make use of that whole ecosystem. You're not doing this on your own. And then remember, all the conversations. You start out with a conversation with the editorial team. Your goal is to get through them to your actual audience on the other side. And how do you get through the editorial team to the other side? By doing effective, persuasive communication. And today we looked at a few examples of how you might do that. But, in the end, these weren't necessarily the only or the most important ones. You have to ask yourself at every point of everything you write, what do I want to communicate? And what is the best way in which I can communicate this successfully, right? And we looked at a few guidelines for how you might do that today. And kind of most importantly, remember to have fun, right? We wouldn't do this if it wasn't fun. And remind yourself of the joy you get out of doing research also when it goes difficult. Thank you very much.